Invite to the podium Diana Whye, President of Born to Raise Consulting Group, Incorporated, to give our inspirational moment. Diana?
Thank you. Good afternoon. On Sunday, January 12th, 2010, a massive 7.0 tiny Caribbean country of Haiti, the birthplace When I awoke to the news of the earthquake on January 13th, I was faced with a tremendous personal and moral dilemma. You see, I had vacation plans for a few weeks later to travel to the Dominican Republic on the opposite end of the island. How could I possibly enjoy my vacation knowing the human suffering that was occurring only a few hundred miles away? I contemplated trying to make my way from the DR to Haiti to aid in the rescue efforts, but quickly learned that it would have been extremely dangerous, and efforts were limited only to professional relief organizations. On January 15th, I attended my regular luncheon meeting of the Rotary Club of Aurora and took the podium to share two things: my personal connection to Haiti and my desire to do something to assist in the relief efforts. Within days of my appeal, my club had raised enough money for not just one, but two shelter boxes valued at over $16,000 to be shipped to Port-au-Prince. But it wasn't just the Aurora Rotary Club that took action to aid the Haitian people. Rotarians around the world joined in to support the relief efforts that continue to this day. So know that when you speak from the Rotary podium, you can invoke the power over 1.2 million fellow Rotarians to stand beside you. That's the power of the Rotary podium and what inspires me about the Rotary family. Thank you.
Kristi Shaffer, Executive Vice President of Junior Achievement, for our Secretary's report.
Thank you, President Jim. Happy Thursday, everyone. I'd like to begin by welcoming all of our visiting Rotarians, guests, and prospective members. And of course, I'd like to start out by recognizing our prospective members. And if you could each stand and give us all a wave so we can introduce ourselves after the meeting, that would be great when I mention your name. So the first prospective member is Steve Stroker, who's a guest of Chris Peters. Steve? Great, welcome. Thanks for being here. Next prospective member is Jim Romano, who's a guest of Jim Johnston. Jim. Great, thanks for being here. And we do have several visiting Rotarians. Rick Luthold from Billings, Montana Club. Rick, you got to get this move going. Okay, good. Good to see you. And then we have Andy McKean visiting from South Jeffco. Andy, welcome. And then for our guests, we have Ken Luff, who's a guest of Pete Wall. Ken, welcome. We have Billy Thompson, who is a guest of Pete Wall, and Don Lewis. Billy, welcome. We have Michael Weiser, from who's a guest of Tom Petrie, our speaker. Michael, welcome. Roxanne Dugan is a guest of Bob Heiserman. Welcome. And then Emily Broschert is a guest of John Stewart's, and Emily is his daughter. Emily, welcome. And then we also have Ann Heritage from the Boy Scouts, who's with Sue Fox. Ann, welcome. Glad to see you back. And now for our announcements. It is the last chance, I believe today, to make your reservations for the Rotary District Area 1 Club Assembly next Wednesday evening, October 29th at the Federal Reserve. If you're planning on attending, we really need to know by today. Due to security reasons, members without a reservation will not be admitted. As noted in the reminder email sent yesterday, we will be doing something new this year. Based on the color-coded name tags, all Rotarians will be divided into discussion groups. After an initial 15 to 20-minute discussion, a lightning round. Ooh, that sounds exciting. I know Jim Johnston's been very involved with this. A lightning round, I like it. Will follow where individuals are free to move to the topic of their choice. This is our club meeting next week, so we will not have a Thursday lunch meeting. Next, Rotary Connect Happy Hour is Tuesday, October 28th at Hacienda, Colorado. Come and get to know your fellow Area 1 and Club 31 Rotarians at both of these events. Now on to family of Rotary news. Our condolences go out to Brian Geis, whose father passed away this week. And I believe I saw Brian here, so sorry to hear about that loss. Also, longtime member Dr. Art Starr passed away last weekend at the age of 94. He was a member of our club for over 54 years. Services will be tomorrow at 2 p.m. at Mother of God. The Denver Post did a wonderful tribute to Dr. Starr in today's paper. If you'd like to take a look at that, please keep both families in our thoughts and prayers. And now, on to our mission moment for the week. I would like to highlight the Center of Teaching International Relations, which is dedicated to finding tomorrow's global leaders by developing and fostering a global perspective, cultivating awareness, understanding, and knowledge and skills to enable effective international relationships. Specifically, our Club 31 Foundation approved a $2,000 grant this year to support student involvement in the World Affairs Challenge, which is a 2-day annual competition for middle school students which challenges teams to come up with ideas to solve global challenges. This past year, the focus was on water, which we all know is an incredibly important international issue. If you'd like to learn more about this particular project, please contact Rotarian John Klug. And I did want to mention we have been talking a lot, and I can't wait for the game tonight. I'm pretty excited about Broncos and Chargers. Go Broncos. But a lot about our challenge with our San Diego club. And as we all know, that these are the kinds of local projects that are supported through our local foundation. And then those challenge grants are going to RI, Rotary International. So thank you all for giving and supporting all of these wonderful projects.
Thank you, Kristi. Now I'd like to invite to the stage Seth Patterson, Principal and Broker of Patterson and Company, and Diana Whye, President, Born to Raise Consulting Group, for an announcement about our Branch Rickey Award.
Thanks, President Jim. I have two messages for you today. First, I want to remind you of AMG National Trust Bank's generous offer, compliments of Earl Wright, to give our club foundation an additional $10,000 over and above their $15,000 sponsorship if we can get about 2/3 of our club members to attend this event. So the theme this year in my mind is butts in seats, and those are your butts. I suspect AMG's marketing department might want to polish that theme a little bit. But with that in mind, and with about 410 attending last year, show of hands, who knows about how many of our members attended Branch Rickey last year? How many think 200? How many think 150? You guys are pretty smart. How many think 100? 75. That's the right number. That's only 28% of our members. A far cry from 2/3. That does not make me proud as a member of Club 31, and if we can't more than double that, we will leave $10,000 on the table. So please buy your tickets, and please don't wait till the last minute. Second, if you really cannot attend, there are many other options to support the event. You'll hear from Diana about the silent auction. Let's talk about the paddle auction for a minute. You know how this works. The auctioneer asks for bids, which are basically donations to our club foundation. It's a simple way to give. Examples we provided of what the differing dollar amounts can do, but at the end it's a donation to our foundation. Even if you cannot attend, I will be quite happy to make whatever bid you authorize me to make on your behalf, and I'll hold to that. I'm issuing a personal challenge to each and every one of you to match my paddle auction bid at $1,000. If you can't quite swing $1,000, that's okay. A lower amount is just fine. We all have different resources. Yes, I know we ask you to contribute many times in many different ways. But just please remember why we ask. We do so for our signature project, Denver Kids, as well as other projects such as Junior Achievement, Shining Stars, and a variety of projects that help those, particularly children, who are less fortunate than our children. Just think of your kids or grandkids' world in 20, 30, 50 years from now. If we do not step up to help their underserved friends and encourage those in our circles of influence to do likewise, I don't see a pretty picture. But you can help make that picture pretty, so please buy your tickets now. Bid as much as you can at the paddle auction, or give me your bid. If you have a non-Rotarian attending as a guest, please be sure they know this is a fundraiser and there are strings attached to that free dinner they're getting. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. An integral part of the fundraising effort of the upcoming Branch Rickey event is the silent auction. As I look around the room today, I can see that all of you are pretty silent auction savvy. So I'm not going to talk to you about what to donate to the silent auction, but I will talk to you about why to donate to the silent auction. I want to help you put a face on your donation. JaVale is an at-risk youth being raised by a single mom who is working to support her kids while attending classes herself. Nahuma is a visually and hearing impaired teenager who is just looking for a way to feel normal and belong so that she can become successful. Santiago is growing up with no father or male role model because his older brother died when he was in the 5th grade. All of these young folks need just a little bit of encouragement and support to help guide them down the right path. This is where Denver Kids enters the pictures and is one, and I repeat, just one of the many organizations that are being supported by the proceeds of the silent auction. So I'm asking you today that when you receive your official email request seeking a silent auction donation for the November 14th event, please respond positively, not just because it's a fun thing to do, but because it's a life-changing thing to do. Let's honor Branch Rickey's legacy by continuing to create opportunities for all people to reach their greatest potential. You can also feel free to see me or Frank Lawrence after today's meeting to get your official donation forms. Let me say in closing that in keeping with the true spirit of the season, I would just like to say, I'm Diana Whye, and I approve this message.
Thank you, Diana. That's great. And now welcome everybody to Thursday Night Football. Let me introduce Don Lewis, chair of the Rotary Foundation Support Committee, and our own Ring of Fame Broncos alum, Billy Thompson.
Come up here, Billy.
Okay, cool.
This will be great. Everyone get your towels out. Everyone get your towels out. Here's the deal. Billy Thompson, a representative of the Denver Broncos, an active player with the Denver Broncos and member of the Ring of Fame, is here today to help us celebrate and challenge everyone to support the Denver Broncos tonight, because we have the San Diego game tonight,
We have the San Diego Chargers, and we're going to win tonight. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I understand that we have a challenge with the San Diego Rotarians. Is that correct? So let's win tonight and let's win the rest of this month. I mean, they can't beat us on any stage. So let's prove it to them. And we'll show them tonight.
All right.
All right, I love it.
Go Denver. Beat San Diego. Go Denver.
Beat San Diego.
Go Denver.
Beat San Diego. Beat San Diego. All right, let's do it.
Now, I hasten to add, of course, that we have 3 ways to donate today. At least $25, please, to everyone who has not given. There are red buckets on each table with an envelope where you can put $25 in cash or more. You can also write a check and put it in there. And finally, we have the famous credit card swipe in the hands of our Executive Director, Darlene Mass, who can take credit cards, and will circulate around to do that. Finally, this is the last day to enter the drawing for the Voodoo Donuts gift certificates. And just put your name on a piece of paper over there, and I will draw the winners after today. Today is the last day to enter that drawing. We also have 3 boxes of Voodoo Donuts over there for the taking for anyone who is interested in having them. And finally, if you had your picture taken with Miles the mascot, your picture is over at the table, so come over and pick it up. We'd love to have you at the table after the meeting, and thank you so much for your support for this effort.
Good job.
I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to this game tonight. It's going to be good. If the Broncos are playing like they did last time, they're clicking on all cylinders. All right, now I'd like to invite up our program speaker, and to introduce our program speaker, Pete Wall of Counsel at Burns, Wall, and Mueller. This is going to be a very interesting discussion, a topic of, that will be presented, and then we'll have questions at the end. Pete?
Thank you, President Jim. If any of you have ever had any connection with the oil and gas industry, you will know the name of our speaker today, Tom Petrie. This is not surprising because he has consulted with Saudi Arabia, the United States government, the state of Alaska, and is recognized as a real expert in this field. Tom is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy and has a BS degree there, as well as a master's degree from Boston University. Prior to joining Petrie Partners, his current company, as chairman, he served as chairman of the Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and prior to that, he was the founder of Petrie Parkman that merged with Merrill Lynch in 2006. During that period of time, Tom and his company were involved in $200 billion, that's $1 billion worth of acquisitions and mergers. As described in the Keyway, Tom is an active member of several industry organizations and has delivered numerous technical papers to those organizations. He has even found time to write a book. It's called Following Oil, 4 Decades numerous other art organizations. His topic today is a strategic perspective on the unconventional oil and gas hydrocarbon revolution. Please join me in welcoming Tom Petrie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete. It's a pleasure to be here. And would you hand me that clicker? And it's a pleasure to be here and have a chance to share with you some of the exciting things that are happening in the oil and gas business, and what I think it means for the country and what I think it means geopolitically, because much of what's going on has an international dimension to it. So what I'm going to do is cover a number of subjects. I'm going to talk about the ubiquitous headlines we're seeing on Shale Gale News, and then talk about the evolution of the technology a little bit and what it means in terms of expanding the resource potential that we have here in the United States. Then demonstrate what that means in terms of our transformed positioning as a country and, frankly, as a state. Colorado is a real beneficiary of what's going on, and certainly the United States is. Then I want to develop a little bit of thought with you about evolving triangles, power triangles, in the Eastern Hemisphere, and how those are reshaping a number of international relations and policy challenges that our country will be facing going forward. And then finally wrap up with some looming policy issues that I think are probably going to be coming to the fore in all likelihood shortly after the election. And finally, I want to take you through some time-tested lessons that I developed as I was writing the book Following Oil that I think speak to the real issues we're going to be dealing with the balance of this decade and probably for the next several decades. There we go. I'll get this down in a minute here. I've done this before, but we'll see if we can't get back to where I need to be. All right, there we go. I've got a heavy thumb today. This one is the biggest challenge I've had. Okay, one. Good. That took a little while. In terms of the evolution of technology, my firm, Petrie, Parkman & Company, was part of a transaction in 2006 that I think was a wake-up call for our industry. Lots of things have been happening before in terms of developing horizontal drilling and multi-stage fracking, and these became the tools for exploiting the new concept, which was instead of trying to find oil that's migrated out of source rock and come into a real high-quality reservoir rock, where the timing of that and the entrapment of that all become risk factors, the industry evolved into something new, which was looking at rocks that are either in source rock or very near source rock, and where the extraction of the oil or the gas from that rock would occur by virtue of breaking the rock apart and improving the paths for its migration to the well. It was a big risk reducer once one could find those kind of opportunities, and it was also a big force multiplier in terms of the resource potential. And so that happened in the spring of 2006. Within 9 months of that time, the industry, having seen the results of that in the Barnett Shale, was pursuing a dozen other plays around the country, and they're shown on this map. And within 2 years of that event, the industry had validated the technical perspectiveness of those two-thirds of those opportunities. As a result of that, what we've seen now is that we now have multiplied the resource potential for oil in this country by at least fourfold. We've multiplied the actual expected recovery of reserves by almost fourfold. And in the case of natural gas, more than tenfold. And that has really changed the picture vis-a-vis what we thought we were dealing with before. One way to look at it is to look at what the IEA in Paris, France, thought was the situation. The left half of this diagram shows the declines that were occurring during the period 1980 up until the middle of the last decade. And that was a period where we had rising fears of global peak oil. And really, we had demonstrated in the U.S. that we'd had peaked in our output all the way back in 1970-71. And it was now becoming clear that much the same pattern was likely to occur in the North Sea, where it was already happening, and in other places around the world, even including the Middle East. But just as the concern about peak oil peaked, what we saw was it's often darkest before the dawn. And in this particular case, less than 2 years after that peaking of concern, what we saw was the beginning of this new era of tapping unconventional hydrocarbons with horizontal drilling and multi-stage fracking. And it gave us the kind of growth curve that we're now experiencing that this chart shows will continue the balance of this decade, probably into the next decade. And I can tell you, based on things I'm seeing, I actually think the onset of the decline that's shown on the far right of this chart is probably too pessimistic. There's a good chance that this opportunity will extend out at least another decade or perhaps two. The other big thing that happened is the price chart. And this is a chart that shows the super cycle in pricing. Oil pricing over my career of 40 plus years has gone from $3 a barrel to the recent high of over $100 a barrel. And with the recent collapse of prices in the near month, we're down to $80 a barrel. I'm not here to say that there can't be a test a little bit lower than that, but I think the real key that I learned and I talked about in my book is that these changes are powerfully self-correcting, both on the upside and the downside. This is, in fact, relatively free markets working when they're allowed to. Back in the 70s, that was not the case, and I analyzed that in some depth in my book. But in this more recent period, we learned from our lessons of the past, and we let oil go to 100 and stay there as long as it would. But in fact, it's now coming in part because of additional supply and the backing out of imports in the U.S., creating a more balanced picture around the country. In the book, what I did was develop a scenario that I think is a base case of expectations for the U.S. And what I show here at the top is a case. It's a base case for 2010. And at that time, we had about a little over 17 million barrels a day of consumption, 10.5 million of which were coming from imports. But what we now can see is by 2018, in the scenario I developed just about a year ago, those imports will decline overall by over 30%, and the over-the-water oil imports will decline by 50%. And furthermore, when you get out into the middle of the next decade, the reduction will be even more dramatic. We are in a position where we could largely back out our over-the-water oil import dependence. Given the role that that's played in much of the geopolitical strategies that the U.S. has been engaged in, including commitments in the Middle East, it has profound implications. And I think it's a mistake to believe that therefore we don't care about what happens in the Middle East. But it does mean our optionality and our range of ways to deal with it has been expanded. It's a tremendous plus that is there. Equally important, and in some ways even more important, it also means that our chronic trade deficit, which I've seen most of my life as an adult, where 35 to 45% of our chronic balance of trade deficit over the last 4 decades has been attributable to rising costs for oil imports, is going to be largely mitigated. It'll be cut in half in this decade, and it'll be all but eliminated in all likelihood in the next decade. That's a profound benefit to us, and it has great implications for the range of options in dealing with lots of other challenges that we have in this country. Now, what I want to talk about now is reaching beyond our shores and address what I talk about as the emerging power triangles. And I think this is one of the most important new alignments of geopolitical interests that has occurred since the end of World War II. It basically involves Russia, China, India, and Iran. And in each case, those countries have power triangles that are emanating from their shared interests in energy issues. The most prominent of these involves Russia, China, and Iran. And since 9/11, the supply to China of oil by Russia and Tehran has grown where it's now a quarter of all of China's supplies are coming from those two sources. The implications of that are that when the U.S. and Europe and Japan want to confront Iran on its nuclear program, they get very little support and very little substantive support from those who are aligned with Iran on the petrochemical and petroleum interests. The other triangles that are involved in these countries are one involving Russia, India, and Iran, and that centers on some nuclear issues as well as energy, as well as natural gas. And then finally, there's a triangle that's not yet complete involving China and Iran and India. India and China are still working out their long-term relationships, and they've got decades and decades of confrontation that really bring lots of baggage to the equation. But all of these overlapping triangles are also causing other knock-on effects. For much of the period from the end of World War II until recently, the Saudis, the people in Abu Dhabi and Kuwait, looked west across the Mediterranean into Europe and to the U.S. for both security and growth of markets. But as a result of what's emerging with these power triangles, the Saudi and its allies are increasingly incentivized and really forced to look much more into Asia for the growth of their future markets. That decline in the over-the-water imports that's developing for the U.S. has negative implications for the strength of the relationship that the U.S. enjoyed with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Abu Dhabi in times past. We have to see how that sorts itself out, but it's a big, big geopolitical question mark at this particular moment. Against that backdrop, what I want to talk about are four major policy issues that I think are looming to be addressed, hopefully post the election coming up. And it's independent of how the election turns out, but I would say the degree to which these policies are going to be embraced may well turn on whether the Senate changes control. The first is U.S. oil exports. The idea that I'd even be standing here and talking about the ability of the U.S. to export oil into the international market, if you'd asked me this 10 years ago, I'd say, well, I don't know, but it's a very, very low probability. It's absolutely transformational. And the reason is that the type of oil that we're now developing in North Dakota in the Bakken, in Texas in the Eagle Ford, and in the Permian Basin, and here in Colorado in the Niobrara, is typically light, tight oil. And it's quite economic, even at today's prices, less economic than it was at 100, but it's adequately economic even at today's prices. The issue, however, is that our refining system is not configured to run all that oil. So we're within a year, in my judgment, of hitting the wall on having the kind of capacity in our refinery system to run as much oil as we'll be able to produce. And you have two choices at that point: reconfigure the refinery system or export the surplus. The other thing is to do nothing, and a lot of what we've done in recent times on the energy policy is nothing. If we do nothing, it'll probably result in even lower prices and disincentives to improve the overall strategic position of the U.S. So I think that should be a non-starter, and hopefully will be, but you have to at least recognize that possibility given how polarized our policy-making mechanism is today. I think it's more likely that, in fact, what we will do is we're beginning already to embrace the idea of oil exports, and if it gains the momentum I hope it does, this will be a major plus for the U.S. economy in terms of job creation and further reduction in our trade deficit. The second issue is the Keystone Pipeline. Keystone Pipeline, I suspect in 2 or 3 decades from now, if it's not built, it'll be a very negative factor for this current administration's legacy. But I'm not convinced it won't be built. It should be. What I want to talk about now is that the reason it hasn't been built over the last 3 years is having unintended negative consequences. What's happening is we're moving much more oil by rail, and we're stressing the railroad system. That's why we're seeing in certain areas derailments of this oil, and with tragic consequences in the case of the very bad accident up in Canada of that oil coming into the U.S., up in northern Vermont and northern Maine. We've had other derailments in this country without the great loss of life that we saw there, but with lots of spectacular explosions. By overloading the rail system to move 750,000 barrels of oil from the Bakken and other new sources, we're also crowding out the ability of the railroads to deliver other critical commodities and goods and services that are part of our economy. Getting grain to market, getting fertilizer to the agricultural markets, and getting manufactured goods to markets on a timely basis is all being impaired by this lack of decision on the Keystone Pipeline. And it's one of the reasons I'm optimistic that post this election, the politics may well align with a decision that's more favorable than it's been over the last 3 years. The very next issue is basically natural gas. And there we've been making some progress on exporting gas. And again, the amazing thing about that is that natural gas, for a long time we thought, was not going to be in the market at all. And we thought we were going to be running out of gas, so we built a large ability to import gas from stranded sources in Africa and Asia and elsewhere in the world, Middle East even. And yet now what we find, having built that on time and on budget, those facilities are very, very underutilized. And one by one they're being converted into the ability to export our gas surpluses, which are now here, they're here now, into the market. Starting less than a year from now, those gas will be exported, and it's going to be a further contributor to our improving balance of trade, even while we still have a manufacturing advantage from lower energy costs and lower petrochemical input costs for the petrochemical industry in our country. So what does that all mean? Basically, we're in a situation where shale oil has dramatically improved North American supply elasticity, both for oil and shale gas. Secondly, oil's fungibility, its relative ease of transport, and its absolute size all argue for it playing a critical role in world trade going forward over the next several decades for the United States. Third, global disruptions and pressures, especially what we're now seeing in the Ukraine, Syria, and Iraq, considerably complicate some of the geopolitical calculations for the petroleum sector. And toward that end, what we're now seeing is that for the first time in a couple of decades, Saudi Arabia has been incentivized to replay parts of what happened in 1985 and 86 when they started to compete with fellow OPEC members for a larger share of the market. Their ability to do that this time is not as large as it was back then, but their incentive to do it is quite large because this becomes a way in which, with all the turmoil in the Middle East, there's an ability to rein in some of the flexibility of Iran with the mischief it's making, and mischief is a kind word, in Syria, and Russia for the role it's playing in Syria. And so that's part of the reason we've had this precipitous decline in recent weeks, to reset, if you will, the relative strengths in economic terms in that part of the world. And finally, the U.S. ability to initiate actions to address Russia's oil economics and therefore its financing for what it's doing geopolitically should not be lightly dismissed. Right now, we have not seen a big inclination to do that, but if there is progress on oil exports, I suspect one of the reasons we'll see that is this final point. I'd like to wrap up real quickly now with one other thing. In my book, Following Oil, it was a real interesting exercise for me because what I ended up doing is trying to really distill a lifetime of experiences that were fascinating down into real lessons learned that have stood the test of time. So I'd like to share those with you in the last couple of minutes and take a couple of questions. Number one, markets do work, and they continuously endeavor to work, but in their own time and at their own pace. And that's part of what we just saw. When oil was at 100 for the last 6 to 9 months, I kept saying to colleagues and clients, I don't really think it's justified here. It should be somewhat lower in terms of fundamentals, but the geopolitics are holding it up. Lo and behold, over time, it started to work in its own time and in its own pace. We saw the reverse of that back in the 70s. Secondly, flawed economic and policy incentives ultimately cause or exacerbate supply shortfalls, or in some cases can sometimes even create undesirable surpluses. And that's a little bit of what we've got going on right now. We've got a surplus relative to the very near-term needs because of some of the policies that we've had. Finally, it's often darkest before the dawn, and that was the case of the peak oil concerns of 2005. 2 years later, we started to ameliorate that in a very significant way. And black swan events. You know, black swans have been written about. These are low probability, high impact events that are not taken into account by people in the marketplace. And if you start thinking, and when they do really surface out of the blue, they become things that really have to be focused on. Ebola is a good example. We're just beginning to come to grips with what happens if Ebola gets out of control beyond the countries where it is out of control already in West Africa. Let's hope that, like Nigeria, they can deal with this in an effective way, that it doesn't spread into a much broader challenge. ISIS is also arguably one of these black swan events, the low probability, very high impact event of a transformational emergence of a new state. A couple of other points that I'll touch on and then wrap up. One, old geopolitical grudges tend to reemerge often at an inappropriate time and with adverse circumstances. Russia dealing with its objectives in Crimea and the Ukraine being a good example. Another one being the sectarian issues that are explain much of what's happening in Syria and Iraq. In addition to that, we've got a situation where shifting global macroeconomic drivers can overwhelm even a well-conceived and well-executed plan. And that is true of all of us in business. We have to be ready to make mid-course corrections and understand it. It applies as well to the country. And that's a period we're now in. I think we're at a point where this administration has a couple more years to deal with some of these issues, and with an appropriate assessment of a mid-course correction for the second term, some of those policy issues I just talked about could be the basis for much more positive outlook for the last 2 years. I actually think that could happen with oil exports, gas exports, a rather different decision on the Keystone Pipeline, if you will, coming up. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure being here. Yeah. Yes.
Tom, I very rarely do this, but since I am running the microphone today, I'm going to go first. I had read years ago, as many of us had, Twilight in the Desert by Simons. And he addressed in Twilight in the Desert the refinery problem system in America. And I was wondering if you could just take a few minutes to expound upon that, and in the fact that we generally have government land available, whether it be old military sites that we're not utilizing at this time, and putting those into action to be used in this refinery capacity in the central part of the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the mismatch on the refining capacity versus the growth is one that really speaks to the sophistication of the refineries in running it. And actually, this light sweet oil doesn't require as much sophistication as we now have. So what has happened so far is that back in the mindset we had in the late 90s, going into the last decade, the industry spent multiple billions of dollars configuring its ability to run heavier, lower gravity oils and do it in an environmentally appropriate and effective way. and upgrade those into good fuels. Now, the issue we have today is, do we dismantle some of these and view that as a sunk cost and therefore an inappropriate investment because we don't want to run heavier oils from other parts of the world that are underpriced? But because we have a configuration that can do it, I think at least in the near term, given the lead times to go the route you're talking, we're going to need to do exports. And the real question will be, do we do exports while we reconfigure to develop some more? There is an issue on the refineries of just how do you build new refineries. But we're at a very interesting time right now where it's not real clear to me that we need to build a lot of new refineries to run this oil. One of the issues we're having is there's some new decisions coming down the road. The success of Tesla with an electric vehicle, and I'm not suggesting we'll all be driving, sports cars that are electric powered, but I think Tesla is proving there may be more viability to the electric vehicle than we've recognized so far. And if that happens, and we also see some natural gas vehicle adoption, which is going on, FedEx and UPS and others are using natural gas in vehicles, then basically we don't need more absolute capacity in any major way. I could see a case or two involving federal lands where you could get the permitting done and so on, but I think the biggest change is to actually diversify the fuel sources where to use the fuel most appropriate and where it's even more environmentally appropriate. One of the big constraints on the electric will be getting the amount of electricity generated with the bad effects of coal. And I choose my words carefully because I'm not totally against coal, and I think coal has a role to play, but it needs to be a whole lot cleaner than it has traditionally been in order to be supplying electricity, especially to the transportation market. Otherwise, you're just shifting the pollution from the tailpipe of the car to a vertical pipe at the utility. I don't know if I've addressed it totally, but that gives you a sense. Yes? This is a little bit of a challenge. I don't have my sunglasses.
Most people probably don't know much about fracking. I know a little bit because my son being in the business of that. But would you explain in some manner what is fracking?
Yeah, thank you. I did debate whether I'd put a lot of slides in on that, but let me take a minute on it because we're ground zero on that right now by virtue of the debates that have been going on, and it's really important for the state of Colorado for us to be an informed part of the electorate on this. Fracking is a technique that's been used for years. It's basically, once you've drilled a well, whether it's vertical or horizontal, in many formations, there's a need to stimulate that rock to give up the oil. And that involves pumping a fluid, typically water, with some additional adds, but not very much. Over 90%, well over 90% is water and very benign substances. There are relatively small amounts of other substances, and that's been a big part of the debate. But you pump it in under high pressure, and it breaks the rock apart. I was involved with drilling a well in northern New York, where fracking is now illegal under the New York state law, back in 1978. It's been done for years, and many more years before that it was there. But what happened that really created the unconventional revolution we're talking about is to be able to, number one, drill a vertical well and turn it and go out, and instead of opening up 100 feet or 200 feet of a reservoir, turn it and drill out a mile, in some cases 2 miles, and then with what's called a multi-stage frac, i.e. a series of fracs over that long distance, you can break apart the rock. It's a mile or 2 miles into the earth, so it doesn't create either pollution problems for aquifers or other problems with respect to subsidence and so on, but it frees up the hydrocarbons to flow to the well. And so wells that in a vertical mode would have made, just to pick an illustrative number, would have made maybe 100 barrels a day, could make 1,000 or 2,000 barrels a day. And that difference in flow rate is the difference between highly economic and uneconomic, especially given the price cycle I talked about. So that's the essence of what we're talking about. There are issues that are involved because anytime you're drilling a well, there's surface disturbance and there's noise and so on. And so the issues for the industry, and I think there's a big effort underway to mitigate every way possible the disturbances and keep them to the absolute minimum. And what you do to do that is you drill wells from what's called a pad, and you drill them out in direction such that you're not poking holes every 20 acres or 40 acres. You're doing it on a 15 or on a several acre pad. You're drilling 15 or 20 wells, and then you're delivering the water and other substances to that, and also minimizing the truck traffic. So the industry is going through quite a learning curve on this, and much of the confrontation and much of the debate you hear is over surface disturbance and then the concerns about whether, in fact, there are problems. I would say my experience, and I'm guided in part by the Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, who's an MIT professor formerly. He and I spoke at a Vail Energy conference a couple years ago, and the environmentalists were ready to probably skewer me or barbecue me, but Ernie stood up, having completed the MIT natural gas study, and substantively addressed that the concerns that were being raised were really way out of perspective, and I think it's quite often the case.
I think we'll be done with questions. Thank you so much, Tom. I want to, first of all,